She built an empire in a city that never wanted her. She married the most dangerous man in Korea. And tonight, standing in the ballroom she built from nothing, she watched him walk in with another woman wearing a dress he bought from his own wife. He thought he broke her. He had no idea she spent 3 years building the cage he just walked into. This is the story of Nia Brooks. And it ends tonight. If this is your kind of story, hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. Now stay with me, because nothing about what happens next is what you expect. Peace. The dress arrived on a Tuesday. Nia remembered that detail the way she remembered most things. Not because she wrote it down, not because anyone told her it would matter, but because her hands had been shaking when she pulled the garment bag from the back of her studio closet, and she'd had to stop, set it on the work table, and breathe through her nose for a count of 8 before she could zip it open without tearing the seam. The fabric inside was black, not the flat, forgettable black of a department store rack, but the kind of black that had depth to it. Silk charmeuse layered over structured organza, the bodice hand-beaded with obsidian crystals that caught light the way a blade catches light, cold and precise and unbothered. She had designed it 3 months ago under a different name, logged it in the Maison Nia catalog as a custom commission for a private client, and sent the invoice through the Baeko-adjacent shell company that handled luxury expenditures for Kang Tae-hyun's inner circle. She had priced it at 12 million won. He had paid without a question. Of course he had. He never looked at the receipts. She zipped the bag back up and hung it on the rack beside the window, where the morning light came through clean and flat and honest. And she stood there with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and she did not feel anything she would call satisfaction. Not yet. What she felt was the specific hollowness of a person who has been carrying a plan so long that the plan has become the skeleton beneath everything. Beneath her smile, beneath her sleep, beneath the careful way she moved through rooms where she was never meant to belong. 3 years. She had been in Seoul for 3 years, and in that time she had built something real from the ground up. And she had loved a man she should never have loved. And she had survived things she did not talk about. And now it was Tuesday morning. 6 days before the Obsidian Gala, and the dress she had designed for Yoon Seo-rin was hanging in a bag in her studio, and everything was almost exactly where it needed to be. Almost. She picked up her phone, set it back down, picked it up again. There were no messages from Tae-hyun. There hadn't been for 4 days. She set the phone face down on the work table and went to make coffee. The studio occupied the top 2 floors of a converted building in Hanam-dong, close enough to the Han River that on clear mornings Nia could see the water from the east-facing windows, silver and moving and indifferent to everything happening on its banks. She had found the space during her first winter in Seoul, when her Korean was still mostly instinct and guesswork, and the city felt like a wall she was throwing herself against every single day. The landlord had been skeptical. She was a 28-year-old black woman from Atlanta with a business plan, a rented sewing machine, and the specific kind of stubborn that people mistake for confidence until they realize it has nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with having nothing left to lose. She had paid 6 months up front. She had worked 16-hour days. She had made mistakes. Wrong fabric weights, wrong silhouette proportions for Korean body standards, wrong pricing, wrong partnerships. And she had fixed each one without asking for help, because asking for help meant explaining herself. And she was not yet ready to explain herself to anyone in this city. The first collection had been small, 10 pieces. A preview showing in a rented gallery space with 30 guests, half of whom came out of politeness, and the other half out of curiosity about what a black American designer thought she was doing in Seoul's luxury market. What she was doing, it turned out, was something none of them expected. Her pieces did not try to be Korean, and they did not try to be American. They existed in the space between, drawing on the textile knowledge she had grown up breathing, the pattern construction techniques her father Malcolm had taught her as a child in his workshop in East Atlanta, the draping methods she'd studied obsessively in the 3 years after his death, when she'd had nothing but grief and library access and his battered notebooks to keep her company. The collection sold out in 72 hours. The second collection had a wait list before it launched. By the end of year 2, Maison Ya was the name on the lips of every stylist, every editor, every politician's wife and chaebol heiress and celebrity who needed to be seen wearing something that could not be replicated, could not be explained, could not be dismissed, Nya understood what she had built. She also understood what it had cost her. She poured her coffee black, leaned against the kitchen counter, and looked at the wall across from her where she had pinned, years ago, a photograph of her father. Malcolm Brooks, age 43, standing in front of his textile workshop in Atlanta, with his arms crossed and his chin up and his eyes doing that thing they always did. Like he was looking past the camera at something only he could see, something that wasn't there yet but was on its way. He had that quality, the quality of a man who could see the shape of things before they arrived. It had not saved him. She drank her coffee. She did not look away from the photograph. She had been 7 years old the first time she understood that her father's work was extraordinary. He had brought home a fabric sample, a bolt of woven cotton in a pattern unlike anything she had seen, the weave structure carrying embedded geometric logic that shifted depending on the angle of light, flat in shadow and dimensional in sun. The colors, deep indigo, burnt ochre, cream, arranged in a sequence that her father explained very seriously as a mathematical relationship he had spent 11 months working out. She had touched it with both hands, the way children touch things they instinctively recognize as important, and she had said, "It looks alive." Malcolm had looked at her for a long moment, and then he had laughed, not the polite laugh he used with clients, but the real one, the one that started low and came up through his chest. And he had said, "That's exactly right. That's exactly what I was trying for." He had spent the next decade refining the technique. He called it Brooks textile logic, an architecture of pattern and weave that could be applied to any fabric, any weight, any cultural context, producing textiles that were simultaneously functional and visually complex in a way that factory production could not replicate. He filed patents. He built partnerships. He flew to Seoul in 2004 when a Korean corporation called Hansung Design Group expressed interest in licensing the technique for a product line targeting the luxury Asian market. The negotiations took 2 years. The contract, when it was signed, was worth more money than the Brooks family had ever seen. Malcolm came home from the final signing with champagne he couldn't afford, and a smile Nia remembered as the biggest she had ever seen on his face. He told her mother Vanessa that everything was going to change. He believed it. He had no reason not to. Within 18 months, Hansung Design Group had restructured its ownership. The Brooks textile logic technique had been absorbed into the company's core intellectual property portfolio under a new corporate name. Malcolm's name appeared nowhere in the documentation. The licensing payments stopped. When Malcolm's attorney sent formal inquiries, the responses were written in dense legal language that functioned primarily as delay, acknowledging nothing, denying nothing, redirecting everything into procedures that led nowhere. Malcolm hired a second attorney, then a third. The cases moved slowly, expensively, in the direction of failure. Meanwhile, the textile patterns that carried his life's work appeared on luxury goods sold across Asia, Europe, and North America, generating revenue that other people counted and deposited and reinvested into an empire he never knew had stolen from him. He died in 2019. Heart failure, the certificate said. Nya knew better. She had watched it happen. The slow erosion, the specific way a person collapses when the thing they built their identity around gets taken and there is no mechanism to get it back. He died at his work table with his reading glasses still on and a legal document in his hand, and Naya found him there on a Sunday morning and sat with him for a long time before she called anyone, because she was not ready for the world to start moving again. She came back to Atlanta from New York, where she'd been working a junior design position at a mid-tier fashion house, to help her mother. Vanessa lasted 14 months after Malcolm. The damage had been done too deep and too long. She spent her last weeks in a hospital bed with her hands folded on the blanket and her eyes moving slowly between the window and the door, as though she was still expecting something to arrive, some resolution that kept not coming. On the last night, she had taken Naya's hand and said, very clearly, "Promise me, your father's name will never disappear." Naya had said, "I promise." She had meant it the way you mean a thing when the person asking it is dying and the room is quiet, and there is nothing in the world except that moment. She had also meant it with the cold operational part of her brain that had been quietly running calculations since the day she found her father at his work table. The part that had already identified Hansung Design Group's parent company, already traced the corporate restructuring documents, already found the name Baeko at the end of 3 layers of shell ownership, and was already constructing the outline of something that would take years and everything she had and possibly her life, and that she intended to do anyway. She flew to Seoul 4 months after Vanessa's funeral. She had $14,000, her father's notebooks, and a plan. Passé. The plan had always been about evidence. Not exposure, not yet, not in the beginning. Exposure without evidence was noise. Evidence was architecture. You built it the same way you built anything that needed to last, slowly, with precision, without announcing what you were doing to anyone who might be positioned to stop you. In the first year, Naya had built Maisonnia and listened. The fashion world in Seoul was intimate and gossipy and deeply entangled with money. And the money in Seoul led, if you followed it carefully, through certain foundations and certain property portfolios and certain import-export companies, back to structures that carried the fingerprints of Baeko. She was careful. She was patient. She made herself useful. Not threatening, not obviously investigative, just present, attentive. The kind of designer who understood discretion and delivered it reliably along with her garments. Her client list grew. Her access deepened. She hired a research assistant and gave her a vague brief about competitor analysis, and the woman was sharp enough to follow threads without asking too many questions about where they led. In the second year, Naya made contact with a financial forensics consultant named Park Ji-won, who worked independently and had his own reasons for wanting to understand Baeko's corporate structure. They met in a noodle shop in Mapo-gu and spoke in half sentences, each one measuring the other for the first 15 minutes. And then Ji-won had set down his chopsticks and said, "You're not here for fashion." And Nya had looked at him steadily and said, "I'm here for fashion and for something else. Those two things don't have to conflict." He had nodded once and agreed to take her money and start pulling threads. It was through Ji-won's work, in the spring of year 2, that she first heard the name Kang Tae-hyun said in a context beyond the abstract, not the public-facing name, the successor to a business empire, the chairman of Baeko Holdings, the man whose photograph appeared occasionally in financial press, alongside carefully constructed statements about legitimate enterprise. The actual name, spoken with actual weight, by people who understood what the name meant. Ji-won had set a document on the table between them, a corporate ownership map, handwritten on large paper because he didn't trust digital files, and tapped a box near the center of the structure and said, "This is the man you're looking for. Everything flows through him." Nya had looked at the name for a long time. She had not yet met him. She had not yet understood what meeting him would cost her. She met him at a client dinner in the 4th month of year 3. It was not an arranged encounter. Or if it was arranged by circumstances she had not manufactured, which unsettled her afterward more than a setup would have. She had been seated 3 places from the head of a long table in a private dining room in a Gangnam hotel, there as the guest of a chaebol wife who wore Maisonnia exclusively and enjoyed introducing Nia as her personal discovery. The dinner was for 40 people. The conversation was the specific kind of elegant, surface level. Nothing that functions as social currency among people who have too much power to say anything direct in public. Nia was fluent in it. She navigated it with her fork in one hand and her attention carefully distributed, present enough to be gracious, removed enough to observe. He arrived late, not fashionably late, not the cultivated tardiness of someone who wants to be noticed walking in. Actually late, the way someone is late when they were held up by something that genuinely could not wait, moving through the room with the compact efficiency of a person who has already decided where he is going and is not interested in performing the arrival. He was taller than she'd expected from photographs. Quieter, also. He took his seat without ceremony, declined the opening remarks that the host attempted, and ordered water. No wine. He ate with the focused attention of someone who treats meals as functional rather than social, and he spoke, when he spoke, briefly. A question here, a one-sentence response there, eyes moving around the table with the even, unreadable quality of someone who has trained themselves to register everything while revealing nothing. He looked at her twice before he spoke to her. The first time was when she was mid-sentence in a conversation with the woman beside her, and she felt the quality of his attention shift onto her face the way you feel a change in temperature. Not unpleasant, just sudden, and precise enough to be unmistakable. She did not break her sentence. She finished what she was saying, laughed at the appropriate moment, and took a sip of her water. And when she looked in his direction, he had already looked away. The second time was when the host made a comment, careless, the kind of careless that comes from never having been the outsider in any room, about the novelty of international designers working in Seoul's luxury space, with the specific inflection that meant foreign, that meant other, that meant what exactly are you doing here? Nia had heard variations of this comment at least 40 times in 2 years and had a response calibrated for it, warm, self-assured, lightly amusing, leaving no room for the condescension to land. She deployed it. The table laughed. The host looked slightly embarrassed. She moved on. Kang Tae-hyun was looking at her when she finished, not the assessment look from before, something else. Brief, attentive, a fraction more direct than he had been with anyone else at the table. Then he looked back at his plate. After dinner, in the corridor outside the private room, he stopped beside her. "You didn't need to soften that," he said. She turned. He was standing at the correct social distance, not crowding, not retreating, with his jacket still buttoned and his expression doing the thing she would come to know well, which was expressing nothing clearly enough that you found yourself reading it anyway. "I wasn't softening it," she said. "I was redirecting it. There's a difference." He considered this. What's the difference? Softening makes the other person comfortable. Redirecting makes you stronger. A pause. Then, "You designed for Choi Min-young." "I designed for several people." "She says you're the most precise person she's met in fashion. She's being generous." "She's not generous," he said. "She's accurate." He handed her a card, plain, heavy stock, just a name and a number, and said, "I have a formal function in 3 weeks. My usual stylist is unavailable." He said it without asking, without performing the request, just stated it the way you state a logistical fact to someone whose competence you have already decided on. Then he walked back into the dinner. She looked at the card. She looked at his name on it. She understood that this was the man Ji-won had placed at the center of the corporate map, the name connected to her father's stolen work, the man whose empire had quietly consumed Malcolm Brooks and moved on without a second thought. She also understood that the thing she was feeling, standing in that corridor with his card in her hand, was not what she had planned to feel. She put the card in her clutch. She went back to the dinner. She did not call him for 5 days, and when she called, her voice was steady. What she had not been prepared for was the quality of his attention. She had constructed a version of him from everything Ji-won's files and her own research had assembled. A profile built from behavior patterns, financial decisions, the testimony of people who feared him. And the profile was coherent and plausible and told the story of a man shaped entirely by the machinery of inherited power and criminal organization, pragmatic to the point of coldness, functional in his relationships, uninterested in anything that didn't serve a calculable purpose. She had prepared herself to work within that profile. She had not prepared herself for the way he listened. It was not attentive in a performed way, not the leaning forward, eye contact, intensive listening of people who have been told that listening signals respect. It was something older and more economical than that. He listened the way a person listens when they are genuinely processing what they hear, storing it, cross-referencing it against everything else they know, not in order to respond faster, but in order to understand more completely. He remembered. Not in the way people remember things they've made an effort to retain, in the way people remember things that actually registered. 3 weeks after she mentioned, offhandedly, that she had learned to drape from her father's notebooks, he asked a question about her father. Not a polite question, a specific one. She had had to redirect. She had been careful. He never treated her as foreign, not in the blunt way the dinner host had, and not in the subtler, more sustained way that Seoul's social infrastructure sometimes performed. The microtransactions of difference, the slight recalibrations of expectation that accumulated over time into a very clear message about where you did and did not belong. With him, none of that existed. She was a person in a room, and he responded to her as a person in a room. And the simplicity of it had disarmed her in a way that all his complexity had not. She had told herself it was tactical, that she was closer to the center this way, that proximity had value. By the time she stopped believing that, she was already in love with him, and it was too late to make the timeline accommodate that information. He proposed in a restaurant they had eaten in 11 times. She counted, involuntarily, because she counted things, with no ring, no announcement, no performance. He had set down his chopsticks, looked at her across the table with that level, unreadable quality she had spent months learning to read anyway, and said, "I want to marry you. Not publicly, privately, with a lawyer and no spectacle. I need the people around me not to know your position until I've secured certain things." He paused. "That's not about hiding you. It's about protecting you." Another pause. "I know you understand the difference." She had said yes. She had told herself she would tell him everything about Malcolm, about the evidence, about what she had come to Seoul to do after the wedding, when they were on stable ground, when she understood how the truth would land. She had believed, genuinely, that the man she knew would be capable of choosing justice over the empire that had made him. She had believed this because she needed to, and she had known, in the part of her brain that never stopped calculating, that needing to believe something and having evidence for it were not the same thing. She had not yet found the courage to test the difference. Seo-rin came back from Paris in October. Nia noticed the shift before she had a name to put to it. The late return times. The phone placed face down when she entered a room. The specific quality of silence that settles over a shared space when one of the people in it is somewhere else in their head. She had grown up watching her mother navigate her father's grief, and she understood the architecture of emotional absence. The way a person who is present physically can be completely unreachable, and the way the person they're unreachable from develops an entire secondary nervous system for detecting the distance. She did not ask directly. She observed. She found the name through a client conversation. Seo-rin's family moved in circles that overlapped with Nia's client base, and the overlap generated information the way social proximity always generates information, through the lateral channels of other people's conversations. Yoon Seo-rin. A lawyer, or had been. She'd moved to Paris 2 years ago for reasons that depended on who was telling the story. Old money family, long history with the Kang family, the kind of history that gets described with phrases like always assumed and before everything changed. Nia had pulled Ji-won's files and found Seo-rin's name in 2 places. Once in a notation about Tae-hyun's personal history prior to year 2 of Ji-won's research, and once in a more recent entry flagged with a question mark that Ji-won had not yet explained. She had looked at the entries for a while and then closed the folder and worked on her collection for 6 hours without stopping. The anonymous messages started 3 weeks later. They came through an untraceable routing, a new number each time, the language shifting between Korean and English in ways that suggested someone trying to obscure whether they were a native speaker of either. The content was consistent. She did not belong here. The arrangement she was in would not last. There were people who would ensure it did not last, and the nature of what they would do to ensure it depended entirely on how quickly she made the correct decision about leaving. The messages were not hysterical. They were specific. That was the thing about them that sat wrong. They weren't the messages of someone acting out of jealousy or personal pain. They were structured like a directive, like something delivered on behalf of an organization. She had shown one to Tae-hyun on a Wednesday evening when he came home earlier than he had in 2 weeks, and she judged the moment carefully and set her phone on the table between them. He had read it. His jaw had tightened, a small movement, the kind she had learned to identify as the external signal of an internal calculation running. He had said, "I'll handle it." He had looked at her with an expression she could not fully read, regret in it somewhere, she thought, but also something that felt like a decision already made about something she wasn't aware of. He had covered her hand briefly with his and said, "Don't worry about this." His phone had lit up 40 seconds later. She had seen Seo-rin's name on the screen in the half-second before he turned it face down. She had watched his expression change. Not dramatically, nothing so obvious, but enough. The slight ease around the corners of his eyes. The microsecond of a different quality of attention directed at the screen. He had excused himself. She had sat at the table and looked at her phone and the space where his hand had been, and the specific flatness of the room after he left it. She did not cry. She had not cried in years. Not since the hospital. Not since she sat with her father at his work table. The circuitry for it had been routed into something else, into the relentless forward machinery of building and planning and assembling, and she could not access it even when some part of her recognized that accessing it might have helped. What she did instead was return to her studio. She opened Jiwon's latest file. She sat down at her desk with the evidence she had been building for 3 years spread in front of her, and she worked through it methodically, checking completeness, checking chain of documentation, checking every link in the architecture for weakness, because she was close now, and close was not the same as finished. And she did not intend to be careless with the last inches of something she had paid this much to build. She worked until 4 in the morning. When she came home, the apartment was dark and Tae-hyun's side of the bed was empty. She lay down without changing clothes, and she looked at the ceiling and she thought about her father standing in his workshop at 43 with his arms crossed and his chin up, and she thought about her mother's hands folded on a hospital blanket, and she thought about a Tuesday morning 6 days from now when she would stand in a ballroom she had built and watch the most dangerous man in Korea walk in on the arm of another woman wearing a dress from his wife's fashion house. She breathed in. She breathed out. She closed her eyes. In the morning, she would finish what she came here to do. The day before the gala, Naya was in her studio at 6 a.m. when Jiwon called. She answered on the second ring. She was standing at the cutting table with a seam ripper in one hand and a section of basted fabric in the other, making a final adjustment to a gown for a client she would never see after tonight, and she set the fabric down carefully and moved to the window where the Han River was visible in the early flat light. "The documentation is complete," Jiwon said. He sounded like he hadn't slept. "Everything, the original Brooks Hansung contract, the corporate restructuring chain, the financial flows from the stolen licensing revenue, the Baeko ownership documentation for Hansung's parent company at the time of restructuring, 2 witness statements from former Hansung legal staff." Nia did not say anything immediately. She watched the river. "It's enough?" she asked. "It's enough. It's more than enough." A pause. "I've been in touch with the Financial Crimes Unit contact, the contact I mentioned. They're prepared to receive the submission after the gala event per your timeline. Everything moves from there." "You're sure about the contact?" "I've been sure for 4 months. I told you." "Tell me again." He told her again. She listened. She asked 3 specific questions, and his answers satisfied her. "Thank you," she said. She meant it completely, the kind of gratitude that does not need elaboration. "Are you safe?" he asked. There was something in his voice that had not been there in earlier calls, a careful quality, the voice of someone who has been watching a situation develop and has arrived at a worry they don't fully know how to say. "I'm always safe," she said. "Nya." "I'll be safe," she said. "I'll call you after." She ended the call and stood at the window for a moment with the phone pressed against her sternum, looking at the river. And then she turned back to the cutting table and picked up the seam ripper and finished what she had been doing. In the afternoon, she drove to the Kong residence, the primary one, the formal apartment in Itaewon that she had shared with Tae-hyun for 7 months and increasingly not shared with him for the last 2. She had her key. The apartment was empty. She went to his study and she set a folder on the center of his desk, precisely placed, and she looked at it for a moment without touching it. Inside was the complete Brooks archive, everything Jiwon had assembled, everything she had added from her own research, her father's original documentation, the chain of evidence from the licensing agreement to the corporate theft to the decades of revenue generated from a technique that had never legally left the Brooks family. Inside also were the divorce papers, signed, notarized, dated. She had written nothing on the folder. There was nothing to write. The content said everything. She walked out of the study and through the apartment and out the front door, and she did not look back at any of it. Not the furniture she had chosen, or the kitchen she had cooked in, or the specific quality of light in the early evenings when the city came through the windows, in a way she had loved before loving it, stopped being something she had room for. She walked to the elevator and pressed the button and waited with her hands at her sides and her face doing nothing. Chat. The night of the Obsidian Gala, Nia arrived 40 minutes before the first guest. She moved through the ballroom with her event director, a meticulous woman named Cha Hyejin, who had worked with Maison Nia for 2 years and knew better than to ask questions during walkthroughs. The ballroom was in the Obsidian Tower, 43rd floor, soul spreading below the floor-to-ceiling glass in every direction. The city cold and brilliant and completely indifferent, the way cities always are to the dramas occurring inside them. The chandeliers had been commissioned specifically for this event, crystal configurations designed to cast the kind of light that made every surface look like something worth filming. The tables were dressed in deep ivory. The floral arrangements were architectural rather than soft. The whole room had the quality of a stage set, which was appropriate because it was. Nia stood in the center of it in a gown she had designed for herself. Deep burgundy, structured at the shoulder, floor length, with a back that was open in a way she had calculated would be the only open thing about her tonight. And she checked the room the way a general checks a field. Everything was in position. Jiwon's submission to the Financial Crimes Unit was scheduled for midnight, 12 hours away. The documentation package had been transmitted to 2 additional parties, a legal journalist at a financial publication Nia trusted, and an attorney who handled international IP litigation and had been briefed in general terms on the case. The folder on Taehyun's desk had been sitting there since the afternoon. He was in the building. She'd confirmed it through Hyejin's venue logistics, which tracked all arriving security details. The black SUVs had been logged 40 minutes ago in the parking structure. She checked the room one more time. She nodded to Hyejin. "Open the doors," she said. The guests came in slowly at first, then in a steady stream. The familiar faces of 3 years, the client relationships she had built and maintained and invested in, the city's elaborate social architecture flowing in through the entrance in its best clothes. Nia moved through it all with the ease of someone who has performed this precise role enough times that her nervous system runs it automatically, leaving the rest of her mind free to do other things. She spoke with everyone who needed to be spoken with. She smiled when the room required it. She was warm and present and entirely somewhere else. She was at the entrance talking with a gallery owner she had known for 2 years when the convoy arrived. She heard it before she saw it, the shift in energy near the entrance, the subtle change in the room's attention that happens when someone whose gravitational field is strong enough walks in. She finished her sentence to the gallery owner. She turned at the appropriate moment. Taehyun crossed the entrance threshold at the same time as Yoon Seo-rin, his hand at the small of her back. Seo-rin was in black. The black of the dress was a specific, deep, dimensional black. Obsidian crystals on the bodice catching the chandelier light in the precise way Naya had engineered them to catch it when she was hand-beating them at her work table on a Tuesday morning with shaking hands. The dress looked exactly as Naya had designed it to look. Perfect. She walked toward them. She greeted Seo-rin first, warmly, by name, with the 2-cheek proximity that Seoul's social register had adopted from European practice, because Seo-rin was her guest and her client, and she was wearing a Maisonnia original that she had no idea she had purchased from her own host's fashion house. Seo-rin smiled the practiced smile of a woman in a complicated situation, trying to appear uncomplicated. Nia held her hand a beat longer than necessary. Then she turned to Taehyun. He was already looking at her. Had been looking at her from the moment she walked toward them, she suspected, though she had not let herself check. He looked the way he always looked in formal settings, contained, controlled. The suit fitted in the way that expensive suits fit, when the person wearing them has learned to carry their body like something they own completely. His eyes were doing the reading thing, the thing she had spent months learning to recognize, moving quickly over her face and finding things she had worked hard to keep off it. She stopped in front of him. She said, "It's not every evening that a husband attends his wife's gala with another woman." The room did not hear it. The room was noise and movement and 40 simultaneous conversations, and she had pitched her voice at exactly the register needed to reach him and no further. But she watched it land. She watched the precise moment of absolute stillness that moved through him. Not physical stillness, he was already still. Something else, something at a level below posture and expression, the stillness of a man whose internal machinery has encountered something it was not prepared for. His jaw moved fractionally, not to speak, just moved. Seo-rin was looking between them. Nya smiled at Taehyun with everything she had, steady, open, the full force of 3 years of work and grief and love and loss compressed into the surface of a smile. And then she turned and walked back into her own gala. She did not look back. Behind her, she heard nothing. Not because nothing was happening, but because the man she had married was standing in the entrance of her ballroom in front of the woman he had chosen over her, wearing the frozen expression of someone who has just understood the difference between a trap and a door. And he had understood, she knew he had understood, that the folder on his desk and the dress his money had bought and the woman standing in the center of this room were not separate things. They were the same thing. He had walked into all of it with his eyes open and seen nothing. She picked up a glass of water from a passing tray. She drank it. She put it back. Across the room, her phone buzzed once. Jiwon, confirming the midnight filing was on schedule. She set the phone face down in her clutch. She had a gala to run. And somewhere in the building, Kang Tae-hyun was opening a folder. Tae-hyun did not follow her. That was the first thing she registered. Not through sight, because she had her back to the entrance and intended to keep it that way, but through the quality of the room. A man like Kang Tae-hyun moving through a space changed the space. His security detail redistributed. Conversations shifted angle. The specific social gravity he carried rearranged everything within a 10-meter radius without him having to do anything deliberate about it. She had spent enough evenings beside him in rooms like this one to know the feeling of him approaching and the feeling of him receding. And what she felt now, moving through her guests with her chin level and her shoulders back and a glass of champagne she had no intention of drinking held loosely in her left hand, was receding. He had stayed by the entrance. Good. She stopped at a cluster of guests near the central floral arrangement. A sculptor and his wife, a textile heiress, she had dressed 3 times. A deputy minister whose name she had memorized 2 years ago for reasons unrelated to his taste in fashion. And she entered the conversation at the right moment, said the right things, laughed at the right intervals. Her face did what it needed to do. The rest of her was somewhere else entirely, running the room in her peripheral vision, tracking exits, tracking the position of Hyojin near the catering corridor, tracking the small red light on the discreet camera mounted at the entrance that her security team had confirmed operational 40 minutes ago. She had cameras at all 4 entrances. She had audio recording in the private reception rooms on the east side of the floor. She had done these things legally, within the parameters of venue management, with documentation that she kept in a separate file from everything else. She was thorough. She had always been thorough. It was the one thing Malcolm had drilled into her that she had never needed to be told twice, not because he was hard about it, but because she had watched what happened to a man who was thorough about his work and careless about his documentation, and the watching had been sufficient. She excused herself from the sculptors' group at the natural pause in conversation and moved toward the east corridor. Seo-rin found her first. Nya had anticipated this, had assigned it a probability somewhere around 70%, high enough to prepare for but not certain enough to count on. What she had not assigned the correct probability to was how fast it would happen, or how direct it would be, because Yoon Seo-rin moved through social environments with the specific efficiency of a woman who had been trained since childhood to perform graciousness while executing something else entirely. And she had crossed the ballroom and come up alongside Nya in the corridor before Naya had covered half the distance to the east rooms. Nya! She said the name the way you say a word you've been practicing, correctly, without warmth, the pronunciation a minor performance of due diligence. Nya stopped. She turned. She took in Seo-rin the way she had been trained by 3 years of fittings and client study to take in a woman in a dress, the hem hanging true, the beading sitting correctly along the bust, the silhouette doing exactly what she had designed it to do. The dress was perfect. Seo-rin's posture inside it was rigid. "You look beautiful," Naya said. She meant the dress. Seo-rin's mouth tightened at the corners. "What did you say to him?" Not a question. A demand wearing a question's punctuation. "I welcomed him to the gala," Naya said, "the same way I welcomed you." "That's not what you said, isn't it?" Seo-rin stepped closer. Not aggressively, carefully, the way a lawyer steps closer to a witness, reducing the distance to reduce the witness's sense of space. She had good instincts. Under different circumstances, Nia might have respected them. "I don't know what arrangement you think you have," Seo-rin said. Her voice dropped low. "But whatever it is, it was never—" "I'm not interested in what it was," Naya said. Her voice was quiet and even, and she did not step back. "I'm interested in what's documented. Those are different conversations." Something shifted in Seo-rin's expression. A microfracture in the composure, there and gone in under a second. But Naya had spent 3 years reading microfractures in composed faces, and she caught it completely, confusion underneath the anger. Seorin did not know about the folder. She did not know about the legal filing. She did not know what document it referred to, and the not knowing was opening a small fault line in the ground she was standing on. "You should go back to your guests," Seorin said. The composure had resettled, but it was sitting differently now, tighter, less natural. "I will," Naya said. "Enjoy the evening, Seorin. The dress was made for you." She turned and walked to the east corridor and did not increase her pace and did not look back. Her pulse was elevated. She registered this clinically, the way she registered most things happening in her own body tonight. Data, useful data, the body's honest report on the gap between what the mind is managing and what the rest of the system actually costs. She had been running on 4 hours of sleep and black coffee and 3 years of accumulated tension that had no outlet available to it, and she was aware that the margin was thinner than she would have preferred. She was aware of a lot of things she would have preferred to be different. She pushed open the door to the east reception room and went inside and stood in the dark for 90 seconds with her eyes closed and her hands flat on the surface of the nearest table, breathing with deliberate control, 4 counts in and 6 counts out, until her pulse came back down to something manageable. Then she turned the lights on and went back to work. Taehyun was in the study by 9:15. She knew because Hye-jin texted her, not with that information directly, but with the information that his security detail had requested a private vehicle from the parking level, which meant he had left the gala, which meant he had gone somewhere, and the somewhere was not complicated to deduce. She read the text standing beside the bar, talking to a fashion editor, and she put her phone back in her clutch without changing expression and finished the conversation she was in. She's imagined it. She did not want to, but the imagination ran anyway, below the conversation, below the smile. Him walking into the study, the room quiet, the city coming through the windows in the dark. The folder on the desk, placed exactly where she had placed it. The edges aligned the way she aligned things when she needed the precision of the gesture to carry weight. Him stopping, him seeing it, him understanding before he opened it what kind of object it was, because he had navigated enough of these moments in his life to recognize the specific gravity a document carries when it's been left deliberately rather than forgotten. Him opening it. Her hands wanted to shake. She locked them at her sides. She excused herself from the editor and found a quiet section of the room near the windows and stood there for 3 minutes, looking at the city below and letting herself be, briefly, the person who was waiting for something irreversible to finish completing itself. She had been in Seoul for 3 years. She had built a company. She had loved a man she came to destroy and discovered she could not separate those two things as cleanly as she had assumed. She had left him the truth anyway. That was the part she had not fully modeled, the part where she did it and it was done. She had spent so long inside the architecture of the plan that the plan's completion had existed as a concept rather than a moment, and the moment was now actively occurring, which meant she was standing on the other side of everything she had spent 3 years building toward, and the other side was not the relief she had expected. It was lonelier than she had expected. She turned from the window and went back to her guests. He came back at 10:47. She was in conversation near the stage area when she felt the room shift the way it had shifted at the beginning of the evening, the particular redistribution of social attention that his presence caused, and she did not turn immediately. She finished her sentence. She laughed. She turned with the natural rotation of someone turning to include a new arrival in an existing conversation, and she found him 4 meters away, stationary, watching her. He was alone. His security was in the room. She could identify 2 of them by now from long familiarity, but he was standing alone in the way he stood when he had made a decision and was implementing it and had no use for company in the implementation. The folder was not visible. He was not carrying anything. His face was doing nothing she could read. That in itself told her something. When Taehyun's face was doing nothing, genuinely nothing, the real version and not the social version, it meant he was containing something large, something that would alter the shape of the room if he let it out. She had seen it twice before, in situations she had not been directly involved in, and both times what came after the nothing face had been swift and final and very quiet. He crossed the room to her. The people around her redistributed without being asked. They had instincts, the city's elite, not about what he was necessarily, but about the specific quality of his intention when it was moving in a direction, and they stepped back from it the way water steps back from a moving object, effortlessly, without acknowledgement. He stopped in front of her. He said, "We need to talk." "I have guests," she said. "After." After is a long time from now. He looked at her. Something in his jaw was working, the fine muscle under the hinge, the one she had learned to watch because it was the thing that moved when he was keeping his voice controlled. "The gala ends at midnight," he said. "I'll be here at midnight." "I may have commitments at midnight." "Yeah." Just her name. The way he said it when he wanted her to understand that the social register of the conversation was over and something else was beginning. She looked at him directly. She made herself look at all of him. The face she had memorized, the eyes doing their reading thing across her features, the contained intensity that she had spent a year and a half loving and would spend the rest of her life understanding the cost of, and she kept her voice level when she said, "Whatever you found on the desk, Taehyun, you already knew. You just didn't know that I knew." He was very still. "That's not all I found," he said. She felt something shift in her chest. Not fear, something adjacent to fear, the specific sensation of a calculation encountering a variable it had not fully accounted for. "What else was there?" she said. It came out flatter than she intended. "Nothing you put there," he said. "Something someone else wanted me to find." The room moved around them, oblivious. 40 conversations, crystal glasses, the low murmur of a city at its most civilized. She looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them moved. "What was it?" she said. "Not here." She nodded once. She turned back to her guests. She felt him behind her for a moment, the presence of him, the specific warmth and weight of standing close to someone whose body you know well. And then he was gone, back into the room, and she was left with the conversation she had turned back to and the thing he had said sitting in her chest like a stone dropped in water, the ripples moving outward through everything. Something someone else wanted me to find. Someone else. She kept her face on the room. Underneath the face, her mind was running very fast through a very short list of people who knew enough to leave something on that desk. And the list was short enough to be alarming, and all of them led to the same problem. Someone had moved before she was ready. Jiwon called at 11:20. She took it in the corridor outside the east reception rooms, her back to the wall, her voice below the level of the ambient noise bleeding through the ballroom doors. "Talk," she said. "There's a problem." His voice was tight in a way she had not heard from him before. Controlled, but stripped of the steadiness she was accustomed to. "Someone accessed the case file." "When?" "Sometime in the last 6 hours. The encrypted backup was touched. Not opened, I don't think, but touched. The access pattern is wrong." "Your side or mine?" "I don't know yet. That's the problem." She breathed. 4 in, 6 out. "The filing is still on schedule." "The filing is still on schedule, yes, but Naya, if someone accessed the backup, they may know what's in it, and if they know what's in it, then they know what's coming," she said. "Yes, I understand. There's more." A pause that had weight to it. "I got a call 2 hours ago from a blocked number. The caller didn't identify themselves. They said," he stopped. She heard him exhale. "They said to tell you that the original Hansung contract wasn't the first agreement, that Malcolm had a prior business relationship with a different Korean entity, and that relationship ended in a way that the caller described as, their words, mutually destructive. They said you'd want to know before midnight." The corridor was cold. She became aware of the cold in a new way. The specific physical sensation of standing somewhere exposed when what you want is walls. "What entity?" she said. Jiwon said the name. Nya stood with the phone against her ear and heard the name and felt something happen in the space behind her ribs that she did not have a precise word for. It was not surprise. It was the specific sensation of a thing you have known was possible beginning to confirm itself. The terrible, vertiginous feeling of a floor you had tested carefully, proving less solid than you tested it to be. The entity Jiwon named was not Baeko. It was older than Baeko, a predecessor structure, a name that appeared when you knew to look for it in the financial archaeology of several corporate histories she had researched, always in early chapters, always followed by restructuring events that left the name behind like a shed skin. She knew that name for a different reason. Her father had mentioned it. Once. In a notebook she had read so many times she had its pages memorized. He had mentioned it in a context she had interpreted, until this moment, as incidental. She understood now that it was not incidental. "Did the caller say anything else?" she said. Her voice was completely even. "They said," and I'm reading this back from my notes, "they said she should ask her husband who introduced Malcolm Brooks to Hansung Design Group. She should ask him before she files." The ballroom doors opened at the end of the corridor and noise came through briefly, the bright, unserious noise of a party. And then the doors closed again and the corridor went quiet. She stood in the quiet. She asked her husband. She had specifically not known, how the Brooks-Hansung partnership had been initiated. Malcolm's notebooks covered the partnership's development and its collapse, but not its origin, the original introduction. The person who had brokered the meeting between an Atlanta textile designer and a Korean corporation in 2004. She had not asked because she had not thought to ask. She had not thought to ask because she had built the entire architecture of her plan on the assumption that Tae-hyun was the instrument of her father's destruction, not the bridge to it. If those were not the same thing, if the bridge and the instrument were two different people, two different histories operating in the same structure but not the same capacity, then everything she knew was complete and also insufficient, and the folder on the desk was not the last move in the game. It was the second to last. "I need you to find out who made that call," she said. "I'm already working on it." "Ji-won," she paused. "Don't file at midnight. Hold it until I tell you." A silence. "Nya?" "I know what I'm asking. Hold it." She ended the call. She stood in the corridor with her phone in both hands and her back against the wall, and the cold of the air around her, and the noise of the GALA on the other side of the door, and the thing she had just learned sitting in the center of her chest, like something that had been there the whole time, waiting for her to find it. The clock above the corridor entrance read 11:23, 37 minutes to midnight. She pushed off the wall. She went back into the ballroom. Tae-hyun was exactly where she had known he would be, standing near the south windows with a glass of water and his security detail at a correct distance, and his eyes already on the door she came through, like he had been watching that door the whole time she was gone. She walked toward him. She did not smile. She said quietly, when she reached him, "Tell me about the introduction." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the controlled nothing face, not the reading look, not the warmth she had spent a year and a half not being careful enough with. Something older than any of those. Something that looked, she thought, almost like the specific exhaustion of a person who has been waiting a very long time to stop carrying something alone. He said, "Which one?" And Naya understood then that there was not one introduction. There were two. And she was standing inside both of them. The ballroom glittered and hummed around them, entirely indifferent, as the clock moved toward midnight and the point from which nothing, not the folder, not the filing, not the 3 years she had spent building every wall of this trap, could be walked back. Which one? 2 words. He said them the way a man says something he has rehearsed without meaning to rehearse it. The specific flatness of a sentence that has been living inside the chest for so long it has worn smooth, all the edges gone, nothing left but the shape of it. Nya looked at him, and the ballroom existed around them the way background noise exists. Present, irrelevant, the world continuing its indifferent operation while the two of them stood in the south window light, with the city spread below them and the distance between them measured in something that had nothing to do with meters. "Start with the first one," she said. He set his water glass on the windowsill. He did not look away from her. "Not here." "You said that already." "I meant it already." "The gala ends in 37 minutes, she said. "I'm not leaving my own event to have a conversation I've been waiting 3 years for. So you talk here, or you don't talk, and I file what I have, and we find out what happens next without this conversation ever occurring." Something moved in his face. Not much. Enough. He understood the filing was real. She had known he would, from the moment she saw him come back through the ballroom door with that particular quality of stillness around him, the stillness of a man who has read a document and understood its full weight. She had known he would not be surprised by the existence of the evidence. What she had not known, what she was understanding only now, standing in front of him with the clock moving and Ji-won waiting on the other end of a held instruction, was that he was not afraid of the filing the way she had expected him to be afraid of it. He was afraid of something else. "Your father contacted Hansung Design Group in 2003. Taehyun said. His voice was low and even. Not the other way around. He was introduced to their licensing director through a broker, a man named Woo Seung-kil, who operated as an independent commercial intermediary between American designers and Korean manufacturing interests. He paused. Woo Seung-kil worked for my father, not for Baeko, for my father personally, before Baeko existed in the form it does now. He was a fixer, a connector. He moved people and interests together for a percentage. Nya was very still. Keep going. The introduction was legitimate. My father had no interest in Brooks Textile at that point. He was not involved in Hansung's licensing decisions, and Hansung was not yet part of the Baeko financial structure. The acquisition of Hansung came later, after your father's contract was signed, after the licensing revenue began generating. He looked at her with something that was close to directness, closer than she had ever seen from him, the reading quality stripped back to something rawer underneath. The theft was not the introduction. The theft was what happened when Hansung became valuable enough to absorb. My father made that decision in 2007. I was 19 years old. You knew, she said. I learned. Later. How much later? A pause. The muscle under his jaw. I was 24 when I found the original Brooks contract in the restructuring documentation. I understood what it meant. I brought it to my father. He stopped. She watched him decide something in real time, watched the decision cross his face in the way decisions only cross faces when the person making them is too tired to fully conceal it. He told me it was business. That intellectual property and licensing agreements was fluid, and the contracts had been legally reconstructed. He had attorneys who had made it clean on paper. It was not clean, Naya said. No, he said. It was not clean. The word landed. She felt it land. She had spent 3 years building a case against this man, and the case was real and complete, and she believed everything in it, and standing here listening to him confirm the case in his own voice was not what she had expected confirmation to feel like. It felt like something being taken from her rather than returned. She did not examine that feeling. She filed it and kept going. Then you inherited the empire, she said, with the theft inside it. Yes. And you did nothing. His jaw was tight. I set aside funds, a restitution structure, routed through a separate holding company. I intended... He stopped. There were complications. Complications, she repeated. The word came out with an edge she had not entirely planned. My father died at his work table with a legal document in his hand. My mother lasted 14 months after him. Those are not complications, Taehyun. Those are consequences. He absorbed this. He did not flinch from it. She noted the absence of flinching because it was not the absence of feeling, and she could tell the difference. I know, he said. Then tell me the second introduction. The silence before he answered was 8 seconds. She counted. Woo Seung-kil, he said. After my father died and I took the organization, Woo came to me. He was old by then, semi-retired, but he kept records the way men like him always keep records. Insurance. He had documentation of the original Brooks introduction, the legitimate version. He also had documentation of what happened after, the Hansung absorption, the contract restructuring, the revenue flows. He looked at her. He offered to sell me the documentation, said if I didn't buy it, he'd find another buyer. And you bought it. I bought it. I also... He paused again. This pause was different, more deliberate. The pause of a man arriving at the specific part of the story he has been walking toward and finding it exactly as difficult as he knew it would be. I also used Woo's network to conduct a background on everyone entering my business environment in that period. Standard practice. New faces, new relationships. Everyone got checked. She understood before he finished the sentence. She felt the understanding arrive in her chest like something cold and structural. Not a blow, not a shock, something more architectural than that. A wall she had been leaning against revealing itself to be made of something different than she had assumed. You ran a background on me, she said, in year 2 of Maison Ya, when you began appearing consistently in circles connected to my business interests. What did the background tell you? His eyes did not move from her face. That your father was Malcolm Brooks. That you had spent 3 years researching Beko's corporate structure through a financial forensics consultant named Park Ji-won. That you had come to Seoul with documentation of the original Brooks-Hansung contract and were building an evidentiary case. He let this sit for exactly one beat. That you were here to destroy what my father built. The ballroom continued around them. Someone laughed near the bar. Glass touched glass in a toast. The chandeliers threw their cold light on all of it, without preference or mercy. You knew, she said, when you met me. When I invited you to that first styling consultation, yes, something tore. She felt it. Not physically, not dramatically, but in the way a structural thing tears when too much has been loaded on it for too long, and the load finally exceeds the material. 3 years of architecture held together by the belief that she had been the one operating with information, that she had been the one building the picture while he moved through his life unaware. That belief had been load-bearing, and it was gone now. And what was underneath it was a kind of cold that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The proposal, she said. Her voice was very flat. The wedding. He said nothing. Answer me. I married you, he said, because I intended to make the restitution real. I thought. He stopped. Something crossed his face that she did not have a category for. I thought if you were inside the structure, I could restore what was taken through channels that didn't require the public destruction of everything. I thought I could give you back your father's name without burning the organization to the ground. You thought you could control the outcome. Yes, by marrying me, by trusting you with access I gave no one else. She looked at him. She looked at the face she had spent a year and a half learning and loving and then watching recede behind the specific cold front of a man managing too many things at once. And she looked at it now with everything stripped back. The love, the plan, the assumption that she had been the architect and he had been the unknowing subject. And what she saw underneath all of it was something she had not prepared herself for. He was telling the truth. Not all of it. There were gaps in it. Edges she would need to examine. The Seorin problem still existed, and she had not forgotten it. But the structural center of what he was saying was true, and she had been in enough rooms with enough liars to know the difference between performance and disclosure. And this was disclosure, and it was costing him something real to make it. She turned away from him. She needed 4 seconds that she did not have. She took them anyway. Then she turned back. You said there were 2 introductions. You told me the first. Woo Seung-kil introducing my father to Han-sung. She looked at him directly. What is the second? He picked up his water glass from the windowsill. He held it without drinking from it. He said, Woo Seung-kil introduced me to you. The 4 seconds she had just used buying herself composure were no longer sufficient. He's alive, she said. He's alive. And the call Ji-won received tonight was from him, yes. She found a chair. Not dramatically. She did not need to sit down from shock. She was not a person who needed to sit down from shock. She had trained that response out of herself the same year she trained herself to stop crying. She found a chair at an empty table near the south wall, and she sat in it because she needed to be low and stable for the next 60 seconds while her mind ran the revised map at speed. Woo Seung-kil, an old man with records and a network, and 50 years of knowing which way power flowed and how to position yourself in relation to it. An old man who had introduced Malcolm Brooks to the people who would steal from him, and introduced Kang Tae-hyun to the woman who had come to settle that account, and was now, tonight, inserting himself into the final act of a story he had been running adjacent to for 2 decades. Why tonight? Why now? What did he want from the move? She looked up at Tae-hyun, who had followed her to the table and was standing beside it, with his water glass and his controlled face and the specific quality of a person who has released the information and is now waiting to see what shape it takes in someone else's hands. He called Ji-won to stop the filing, she said. He knew about the filing, which means someone told him, which means... She stopped. The calculation ran. He has someone inside my operation. He has someone inside mine as well, Taehyun said. Has for years. I've known and managed it without removing the person because removing them would signal that I knew. Who? My logistics director, a man named Bei Chul Ho. She stored this. What does Wu want? He wants the original documentation, the legitimate version, the actual Brooks Hansung contract with the original signatures before the restructuring altered it. He doesn't have it. He has copies of secondary materials, but not the primary document. Tae-hyun sat down across from her. This was the first time he had sat in her presence tonight, and the gesture had a finality to it, like a person setting down something they've been carrying at a door. The primary document is what makes the filing irrefutable. Without it, the case is strong but defensible with enough money and enough attorneys. I have the primary document, she said. I know. Wu wants it. He wants to sell it back to me. That's the play. He surfaces tonight, uses Ji-won's call to introduce the variable, creates enough uncertainty to pause the filing, and then approaches me with an offer. The primary document in exchange for a sum that reflects what 50 years of leverage is worth to a man who has been building toward this moment since my father was alive. She looked at him across the table. The ballroom was entering its late phase, the energy shifting, some guests departing, the volume of conversation dropping slightly as the night thinned. The clock behind the bar read 11:41, 19 minutes to midnight. He miscalculated one thing, she said. Which thing? He assumed I'd paused the filing when Ji-won told me about the call. She leaned forward slightly. I haven't paused the filing. I've delayed it by my own choice. That's not the same thing. The decision is still mine. Something changed in Tae-hyun's face. Not surprise. Recalibration. She watched him adjust the picture he had been carrying, make room in it for this specific piece of information. If you file tonight, he said carefully, without the primary document, the case is strong but defensible. You said. Yes. With enough money and attorneys. Yes. Whose money? She said. Yours and the organization's, which means a legal battle that runs for years, which means my father's name stays in dispute for however long it takes to resolve. She looked at him. I didn't come here for a legal battle that runs for years. I came here for resolution. Then you need the primary document. I need the primary document, she agreed, which means I need Woo Seung-kil to surface it, which means I need to understand what he actually wants well enough to give him a version of it that doesn't cost me what I'm not willing to pay. Tae-hyun was quiet for a moment. She watched him thinking, watched the internal machinery of a man who had been navigating complex leverage situations since his 20s, running the same calculation she was running and arriving at the same problem. He'll want to meet tonight, Tae-hyun said. That's how he operates. He creates urgency and then offers resolution before the urgency expires. It keeps the other party off balance. Then we need to be somewhere he can reach us. A pause. We, he said. She looked at him steadily. You know him. You know how he moves, what he values, where his leverage is. I have the evidence and the filing and the thing he actually wants. She let this sit for exactly the right amount of time. I'm not offering you a reconciliation, Tae-hyun. I'm offering you a transaction. Help me get the document and I file with the primary evidence and your restitution structure becomes part of the legal record, which limits the criminal exposure for the current organization. And the divorce papers are already signed. That's not the negotiation. He looked at her for a long time with the water glass in his hand and the city behind him and the clock moving toward midnight. And she looked back at him and did not offer anything beyond what she had already put on the table, because offering more would have been weakness, and they were past the point in this evening where weakness was a recoverable position for either of them. Then his phone lit up on the table between them. They both looked at it. The screen showed a number she did not recognize. No name attached. 11 digits. A sole area code she identified from long familiarity as associated with Mapo-gu. Tae-hyun looked at her. That's him, he said. She reached across the table and picked up his phone. She answered it. The voice on the other end was old and dry and completely unbothered. The voice of a man who had been in rooms like this one, figuratively speaking, more times than she had been alive, and who had learned long ago that urgency was a resource you manufactured in other people, not something you felt yourself. Ms. Brooks, Woo Seung-kil said. Or is it Mrs. Kong tonight? I confess I've lost track. She said, "Tell me what you want." A pause that had something like appreciation in it. Direct. Your father was direct too. It was one of his better qualities. Another pause. I have what you need. You have what I need. I suggest we discuss the terms in person. I'm in the building. The cold structural feeling returned, faster and harder this time. He was in the building. He was already here, already inside the perimeter she had spent 6 months constructing, already in the room she had built to be the last move in a game she thought she controlled. And the understanding of how completely and specifically she had been miscalculating the number of players on this board hit her with the full weight of something she could not afford to show on her face in the next 3 seconds, while the old man's voice waited on the other end of the line. She breathed. 4 in. She did not make it to 6. Where? She said. The East reception room, he said. The one with the cameras you turned on at 8:15. Bring them both. I'd rather say this once. He ended the call. Nia set the phone on the table. She looked at it for 1 second. She looked at Tae-hyun. He was already standing. She stood. They walked toward the east corridor together, and the ballroom moved around them, crystal and light, and the city's best faces doing the city's best impression of a world where nothing was at stake. And Nia walked through all of it with her jaw set and her hands steady, and the understanding that the trap she had spent 3 years building had just been walked into by someone other than the person she had designed it for. And in 11 minutes, the clock would hit midnight, and the man waiting in the East reception room had been watching her build this trap from the beginning, and the corridor was empty. The way corridors go empty when the people who move through them have been redirected by someone who understands logistics. The catering staff rerouted, the event personnel pulled to the main floor. The ambient foot traffic of a working gala cleared from this particular stretch of hallway with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been arranging rooms for 50 years and knew that the most important conversations required the right kind of emptiness around them. Nia noticed this before she reached the door. She slowed her pace by a fraction. Tae-hyun, half a step to her left, noticed her slow and matched it without being asked. The specific attunement of two people who have shared enough physical space to read each other's bodies. Even now, even here, even with the divorce papers signed and the folder on the desk, and 3 years of competing architectures colliding in the space between them. He cleared the corridor, she said quietly. He would, Tae-hyun said. How many people does he have in the building? At least 3, possibly 5. He doesn't travel with more than that anymore. He's past the age of wanting to manage large security details. A pause. He's not here for violence, Nia. That's not his instrument. What's his instrument? Information, leverage. The specific patience of a man who has been waiting for the right moment for 20 years and believes tonight is it. She looked at the door at the end of the corridor. The East reception room, the one she had activated cameras in at 8:15 as part of standard venue security, the one Woo Seung-kil had named with the specific accuracy of a man who had done his reconnaissance before she'd finished setting up her own. She thought about the cameras. She thought about the recording running on the other side of that door right now. The audio and visual capture that was transmitting to a secure storage system she controlled. And she thought about whether Woo knew that and had accounted for it, or whether this was the one variable he had missed. She decided she could not afford to assume he had missed it. When we go in, she said, I talk. You don't volunteer anything he hasn't asked for directly. If he asks you a direct question, answer it short. Don't fill silence. Tae-hyun looked at her. You're running this. I've been running this for 3 years. Tonight is just the first night you know about it. Something crossed his face that she did not have time to read. She pushed the door open. Woo Seung-kil was seated at the head of the rectangular table in the center of the room, his hands folded on the surface in front of him, his posture the particular upright stillness of a man whose body has been trained by decades of boardrooms and back rooms into a permanent performance of command. He was older than she had imagined from the research, late 70s, possibly older, his face carrying the specific compression of age over strong bone structure. Deep-set eyes that moved to the door the moment it opened and did not move from it until he had taken in both of them completely. Beside him, standing against the wall with his jacket buttoned and his hands clasped behind him, was a man she recognized. Bae Chul-ho, Tae-hyun's logistics director. She felt Tae-hyun go absolutely rigid beside her, not visibly. His posture didn't change. His face didn't change. but she felt it the way you feel a temperature drop in the skin, in the immediate air. He had known Bay was the inside source. He had managed around it for years without removing him. Seeing him standing in this room, in this context, with this specific positioning that announced itself as alliance rather than presence, that was something Tai-hyun had not fully calculated. She filed it. She kept moving. She walked to the table and took the chair directly across from Woo. She did not look at Bay again. She looked at the old man and she put her hands flat on the table, not folded. Flat, open, deliberate. And she said, "You have 5 minutes before I decide whether to file with what I have or wait for what you're offering. Use them." Wu looked at her for a moment with something that was genuinely close to pleasure. Not warmth, not kindness, but the specific appreciation of a strategist encountering another strategist, the aesthetic response to a move well made. "Your father had that quality," he said. "The ability to state a position without excess." He paused. "It's a shame he pointed it at the wrong problems." "Don't talk about my father. I introduced your father to the people who made him and destroyed him. I think I have standing to talk about him." He said this without apology, the way you state a fact about the weather, present, inarguable, not requiring emotional acknowledgement. "I want you to understand something, Ms. Brooks, before we discuss terms. I did not arrange for Malcolm's contract to be stolen. That was Kang Sung-jin's decision, made in 2007. 3 years after I facilitated the introduction, and 2 years after I had ceased any operational involvement with Han Sung. I am not the man who took what was his." "Boritskinlis, you built the road," she said. "You don't get to disclaim the destination." Something shifted in his eyes. Not retreat, acknowledgement. These were different things. "Fair," he said. Taehyun had taken the chair to her right. She was aware of him there. Aware of his breathing, which was controlled and slightly slower than normal, the breathing of someone managing a specific kind of anger that has nowhere useful to go. She was aware of Bae Chul-ho still standing against the wall to her left. She did not look at him. "The document," she said. Wu reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and produced a flat envelope, cream-colored, the kind used for formal correspondence, sealed with a strip of tape that had been applied neatly and recently. He set it on the table between them and moved his hands away from it. He did not push it toward her. She looked at it. She did not reach for it. "What do you want?" she said. "2 things, Wu said. "The first is money. I have a number. It's large enough to reflect what this document is worth, and not so large as to be theatrical about it. 50 million won, transferred tonight, upon verification of the document's authenticity. And the second thing," he looked at her with those deep-set eyes that had seen 50 years of this specific kind of room and knew every surface of it. "The second thing is that when the legal proceedings begin, when Malcolm Brooks' name and legacy are restored to the public record, my name does not appear in any testimony, any filing, any documentation, any public statement. I introduced him to the wrong people for money, and I spent 20 years telling myself it was not my fault, and I am old enough now to know that it was partially my fault, and I am not willing to spend whatever time I have left in a courtroom or a cell." He paused. "I want to be a footnote, or I want to not exist in the record at all. That is what I'm selling the document for." The room was quiet. The muffled noise of the gala came through the walls in a low hum. The city celebrating itself 43 floors above Seoul, oblivious. Nia looked at the envelope. She looked at Wu. She looked at the specific arithmetic of what he was offering, what he was asking, and the places where the math worked, and the places where it required her to make a decision she could not unmake. Her phone buzzed in her clutch. She did not take it out. She knew from the pattern, 2 short, 1 long, that it was Ji-won. She knew what Ji-won was asking. She had 8 minutes to midnight. "Verify the document," she said. Wu nodded once. He slid the envelope across the table. She picked it up. She broke the tape seal with her thumbnail, clean, careful, not rushing. And she removed the document inside and she unfolded it on the table in front of her and she read it. It took her 4 minutes. She read it twice. Her hands did not shake. She was aware, in the deep background of everything, that she was reading her father's signature on the original line, Malcolm Brooks, his handwriting, the specific formation of the capital M that she had known since childhood, the same handwriting that filled the notebook she had memorized in the years after his death. She was aware of this, and she did not react to it, and the cost of not reacting to it was significant, and she paid it and kept reading. The document was authentic. She was certain of it in the way she was certain of fabric quality under her hands, not from a single indicator, but from the accumulated weight of details that all pointed in the same direction. The paper stock, the date formatting, the specific legal language of the original agreement, the signature of the Hansung licensing director whose name she had researched thoroughly enough to recognize his signature from the shape of the letters. This was the document. This was what she had come to Seoul for. She folded it. She held it in both hands on the table. "The money is transferable tonight," she said. Her voice was even. "The second condition requires something from you in addition to the document." Wu waited. "You said you want to be a footnote or absent from the record entirely. That requires cooperation, not just silence. There will be proceedings that examine how the Brooks Hansung introduction occurred. The question of origin will be raised. If you're not in the record, someone else needs to be named in your place as the introduction point, a name that can be substantiated." She looked at him. "Give me someone I can use." Something moved in Wu's face for the first time. Not surprise, but the recalibration of a man encountering a countermove he had assigned a lower probability to. He looked at her for a moment with genuine assessment. Then Bae Chul-ho moved. He came off the wall fast. Not at her, not at Tae-hyun, toward the table, toward the document in her hands. And she had the first half second of not understanding what was happening. And then she understood completely, and her hands closed on the document, and she pushed back from the table and stood, and the chair went back behind her, and Bae was across the table in the space she had just vacated with his hand out and his face doing the thing faces do when someone has been waiting for a specific moment for a long time, and the moment has arrived, and the patience is done. "Bae," Tae-hyun's voice, flat and final, and carrying the specific registers she had heard from him once before in a context she had not been meant to witness. The voice of a man addressing someone who has just made an irrevocable error. Bae stopped. His hand was 6 inches from where the document had been. He was breathing hard. The breathing of someone running an adrenaline burn, the specific ragged quality of physical urgency suddenly halted. He looked at Tae-hyun. "Step back," Tae-hyun said. Bae did not step back. "Who?" Nya said. She was standing with the document against her chest and her back near the east wall, and her eyes moving between Bae and Wu, and the calculation running very fast in her head. "Who is he doing this for? Not you," she said to Wu. "He wouldn't move without instruction. Whose instruction?" Wu was sitting very still with his hands flat on the table and his face doing something she could not immediately interpret. And then she interpreted it, and what it was the expression of a man watching a situation exit the parameters he had constructed for it. The specific stillness of a strategist whose board has been moved by a piece he did not play. "I didn't instruct him," Wu said. "Then who did?" Tae-hyun stood up. He was taller than Bae by 3 inches, and the room understood this fact the way rooms understand physical realities. He said, "Bae, last time." Bae looked at him, and then Bae did something she had not assigned any probability to at all. He laughed. Not a full laugh, not from amusement, but the short, pressurized release of a man who has been managing a double position for so long that the release of it, even now, even here, produces something that comes out looking like a laugh, because there is no better shape available for it. "You know what you are, Bae said to Tae-hyun, and his voice was not the voice of a logistics director or an employee or a man in a subordinate position. It was the voice of someone speaking from a different position entirely, from the other side of something. You know exactly what you are, and you've spent 10 years telling yourself the restitution structure made it bearable, telling yourself you were different from your father. You sat across from this woman for a year and a half, and you let her love you, and you never told her what you knew about her father the day you met her. The room had no sound in it except Bae's breathing and the distant hum of the GALA and the blood moving in Nya's ears. "She came here to destroy you," Bae said, "and you used her instead. Different method. Same result as your father." Tae-hyun crossed the table in 2 steps and hit Bae once. Not wildly, not from rage, with the controlled economy of a man who has made a physical decision and is implementing it precisely. and Bei went down against the wall and stayed there with his hand over his face and blood coming through his fingers from the cut the impact had opened above his cheekbone. No one moved. Nya looked at Tae-hyun standing over Bei with his hand open at his side and his chest moving and a redness around his eyes that she had never seen before in 18 months of knowing his face in every register it had. And she looked at this and she understood that Bei's words had landed somewhere real and deep, and that Tae-hyun's response had not been about shutting Bei up, so much as it had been the physical expression of something he could not say out loud in this room in front of her. Woo had not moved. He was watching all of it with his hands still flat on the table and his face composed in the specific way that very old, very experienced men compose their faces when violence occurs in rooms they are in. Not afraid, not approving, simply present, cataloging. Bei was placed in my organization by Seorin's family, Tae-hyun said. His voice was not fully controlled. There was a roughness in it that the control was struggling to contain. He was not looking at Bei anymore. He was looking at the wall above Bei's head. I knew he was reporting to them. I did not know they had made a separate arrangement with you. He looked at Woo. Who gave them the information about the filing? The same person who told Seorin's family that a Black American designer had come to Seoul with evidence against the Baeko financial structure, Woo said. He paused. The same person who suggested that rather than waiting for the evidence to surface publicly, it would be more efficient to acquire the primary document, remove the most damaging element from the record, and allow the remaining case to proceed in a form that named Kang Sung-jin's estate and the original Hansung structure, entities that no longer existed in actionable form, without touching the current organization. He looked at Naya. The document you are holding was not only going to restore your father's name, in the wrong hands, it was going to be used to redirect the proceedings in a way that preserved Baeko's current structure entirely. She looked at the document in her hands. She looked at Woo. You were going to sell it to me, she said slowly, to prevent Seorin's family from getting it first. I was going to sell it to whoever arrived at this table tonight willing to pay and capable of using it correctly. You arrived with Tae-hyun, which told me the situation was more complex than either side had originally constructed. He looked at her with those 50-year eyes. You are not the only one who has been building something for a long time, Ms. Brooks. Bei made a sound against the wall. Not words, just the involuntary noise of a man reassembling himself after impact. Nia did not look at him. Her mind was running at a speed that felt almost external to her, the calculations executing faster than she could consciously track. The document in her hands, the filing on hold, Ji-won waiting, the clock at 11:54. Seorin somewhere in the ballroom wearing a dress that cost 12 million won and carrying the weight of a family that had been moving pieces on this board from a direction Naya had not been watching because she had been watching Tae-hyun. She had been watching the wrong direction. 3 years. She put the document inside her clutch. She looked at Woo. The transfer happens when I confirm the filing has been received and the document authenticated by my legal counsel, not before. She looked at Tae-hyun. I need 5 minutes and your phone. He handed her the phone without a word. She called Ji-won. He answered on the first ring. The document is in my possession, she said. Authenticated visually, pending forensic confirmation. The filing proceeds at midnight with the primary document included. But Ji-won, I need you to add a supplemental submission, a second package. She looked at the East Room door. It covers Seorin's family's interference in the evidentiary chain. There's a man named Bae Chol-ho who can provide testimony. She paused. He's currently very motivated. Ji-won said, I need 20 minutes. You have 6. She ended the call. She turned. She looked at the room. Woo at the table, Bae on the floor, Tae-hyun beside her, the document secured, the clock at 11:55, the GALA humming through the walls in its beautiful indifference. She looked at Bae. Get up, she said, and start talking. Bae looked at her from the floor with blood on his face and something that had shifted in his eyes. The specific shift that happens in a person when the position they have been holding collapses and they are left in the rubble of it trying to determine which way survival points. He looked at Tae-hyun. He looked back at Naya. He looked at the door. There's nowhere to go, she said. Not threatening, just accurate. He started to get up, and then the East Room door opened. and Yoon Seo-rin walked in. She was still in the dress. The obsidian beading caught the room's light the same way it had caught the ballroom's light. Cold, precise, without warmth. Her face was composed in the way it had been composed in the corridor earlier. The practiced surface of a woman who had grown up learning that composure was armor, that the face you showed determined the ground you stood on. But something had cracked in it. Not much, not visibly to anyone who didn't know how to look. And Naya knew how to look. Seo-rin looked at Bae on the floor. She looked at Woo at the table. She looked at Tae-hyun. Yun. Then she looked at Nia, and she said quietly, with a steadiness that cost her something real to maintain, "My family did not authorize Bae to take the document. That was his own decision." She paused. "I came to stop him." The room held this. Nia looked at her. She looked at the dress. 12 million won, hand-beaded, designed by the woman standing across from her for the woman standing across from her. The specific closed loop of that fact sitting in the room alongside everything else. She looked at Seo-rin's face, the crack in the composure, the steadiness that was being produced at real cost. And she ran the calculation of whether this was performance or whether this was a woman who had arrived at the outer limit of what she was willing to participate in and had made a decision about it. The clock on the wall behind Woo read 11:58, 2 minutes. Nya looked at Tae-hyun. He was looking at Seo-rin with an expression she could not read and did not try to. She looked at Seo-rin. "Sit down," she said. Seo-rin sat. Nia took out her phone. She opened the camera roll. She found the photograph she had taken of the document 40 seconds after she authenticated it. Full frame, both pages, every signature visible. And she sent it to Ji-won with a single line. "This is the primary. Proceed." She put the phone in her clutch. She looked at the room, all of it, every person in it, the old man at the table and the bleeding man on the floor, and the woman in the dress, and the man she had married standing beside her with his jaw set and his hands at his sides. And she stood in the center of it with her back straight and her face doing nothing and the document secure in the filing 60 seconds from completion, and she said, "The clock hit midnight." Nia felt it more than she saw it. A shift in the quality of the room, something settling the way pressure settles after a long storm. The specific stillness of an irrevocable thing completing itself. Her phone buzzed once in her clutch. She did not take it out. She knew what it was. Ji-won, confirming receipt. Confirming the filing had been submitted to the Financial Crimes Unit with the primary document attached, time-stamped, logged, beyond the reach of any amount of money or organizational pressure to quietly redirect into a drawer somewhere and forget. It was done. She stood in the East reception room with the document secured and the filing complete, and the room full of people who had spent varying amounts of time trying to prevent exactly this outcome, and she breathed. A real breath, not the controlled 4 count she had been running all evening, but an actual breath, the kind the body takes when it has been waiting a long time to take one. And she let the air out slowly, and she looked at the wall across from her, and she did not feel what she had expected to feel. She had expected relief. Something clean and final, the emotional equivalent of a door closing on a room you no longer needed to be in. What she felt instead was more complicated and less satisfying than that. A heaviness that was not grief and not regret, but something in between. The specific weight of a thing accomplished at a cost you understood intellectually, but had not yet finished paying in the currency of the body and the chest and the slow reckoning of sleep. She turned back to the room. Woo Sung-kil had not moved from his chair. He was watching her with those 50-year eyes, his hands still on the table, and when she turned, he read her face the way he read everything, efficiently, without sentiment, storing the data and moving on. "It's filed," he said, not a question. "It's filed." He nodded once. The nod of a man who has lost a negotiation, but lost it cleanly, without embarrassment, because a clean loss to a competent opponent was something he had enough years behind him to absorb without drama. "The transfer will happen," she said, "after forensic authentication, 48 hours. That's acceptable." He reached for the water glass someone had left on the table. Not his, she noted, someone from the event setup, left behind when the staff had been cleared from the corridor. And he drank from it without apparent concern about whose it was. "You should know," he said, setting it down, "that Bae did not act independently. He received a message 2 hours ago from a number connected to Seorin's family office. The message instructed him to acquire the document by whatever means necessary before the midnight deadline. Nya looked at Seorin. Seorin was sitting where Naya had told her to sit, her hands in her lap, the beaded dress catching the room's flat overhead light in a way that made it look colder than it had looked in the ballroom. She had not spoken since she sat down. She was looking at the table surface in front of her with an expression that had passed through composure and out the other side into something raw. Not devastation, not guilt exactly, but the specific exhausted look of a person who has been managing a position they did not fully choose and has finally arrived at the place where managing it requires more than they have left. "I didn't send that message," Seorin said. She said it to the table. Then she looked up. At Naya, not at Taehyun, at Naya specifically, which Nya registered. "My uncle runs the family office. I haven't had operational involvement for 2 years, since Paris." "But you knew about the document," Naya said. A pause. "I knew there was documentation. I didn't know the details." "And Bae? I knew Bae reported to my family. I didn't know what he'd been instructed to do tonight." She looked at her hands. "I came here tonight because Taehyun asked me to come. Because he said the gala was a public event and my presence would signal that the business relationships between our families were still functional." She paused. "I understood later in the evening that that was not the only reason I was here." The room absorbed this. Taehyun was standing near the wall with his arms at his sides and his face in the nothing register, the real one. Nya looked at him and waited. "Seorin's presence tonight was visible," he said. His voice was careful, not cold, just precise in the way speech becomes precise when a person is choosing every word from a position of real accountability rather than defense. Visible in a way that would draw attention away from the legal proceedings and toward a personal narrative. The story of a powerful man and a romantic triangle is easier to consume than the story of 20 years of corporate theft. He looked at Naya. "I thought I was protecting the proceeding by giving the room something else to look at." "You used her," Naya said. "Yes." "And you used me." The word landed in the room and stayed. He did not deflect it. He did not qualify it. He looked at her with that exhausted directness, and he said, "Yes. In the beginning, I used the proximity. I told myself it was strategy. I told myself the restitution structure made it different from what my father had done." He paused, the muscle under his jaw. "It wasn't different enough." Seorin made a small sound, not a laugh, not quite, and looked at the wall. Bae Chul-ho was on a chair now, someone having put him there at some point, with a folded cocktail napkin pressed against the cut above his cheekbone, and his eyes moving between the people in the room with the wary calculation of a man assessing which version of the next hour was least damaging to him personally. Nia looked at him. "You'll give a full statement," she said, "tonight, before you leave this building. Every instruction you received, every piece of information you passed, every communication between yourself and the Yoon family office regarding the Brooks documentation and the filing timeline." She paused. "In exchange, my attorney will note your cooperation in the supplemental submission. That's the only offer you get, and it expires when you walk out that door." Bae looked at her. He looked at Taehyun. Taehyun said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. Bae looked back at Naya and nodded. She took out her phone and called Ji-won again. He arrived 22 minutes later with a recorder and 2 printed statement forms, and the quiet professional competence of a man who had been preparing for this specific moment for 4 months, and was not surprised to find it messier than anticipated, because everything was messier than anticipated, and he had built the time into his preparation. The statements took an hour. Nya sat in the corner of the East reception room while Ji-won worked through Bae's account, and Woo provided the supplemental corroboration of the Yoon family office's involvement in the evidentiary interference. Seo-rin gave a separate statement, shorter, covering what she knew and the boundary of what she didn't, drawn with the precision of a woman who had been trained as a lawyer and understood exactly how much territory she was covering and how much she was leaving open. Nya listened to all of it without interrupting. She noted inconsistencies and passed them to Ji-won through the folded corner of a cocktail napkin, a private shorthand they had developed over months of exactly this kind of lateral communication. The ballroom outside had quieted. Through the wall, she could hear the last conversations of departing guests, the specific late gala sound of an event closing down, the scrape of chairs, the muffled instructions of staff beginning breakdown, the city reasserting itself as the human noise thinned. Her gala. She had not been in the room for its final hour. She found, examining this fact, that she did not have a strong feeling about it either way. The gala had served its purpose before it was half over. At 1:47 in the morning, Jiwan gathered his materials, confirmed the transmission of the supplemental filing with the Financial Crimes Unit, shook Naya's hand with both of his, and left. Wu left 20 minutes later without ceremony. Standing, buttoning his jacket, looking at Naya with those 50-year eyes for a moment before he moved. "Your father would have been proud," he said. "Don't," she said. He nodded. He walked out. Bei left under escort, two of Taehyun's security detail, who had materialized in the corridor at some point in the preceding hour, with the quiet inevitability of men who had been positioned outside a door and had understood without being told that the appropriate moment to enter had not yet arrived. He left without looking at anyone. Seo-rin stood. She smoothed the front of the dress. An involuntary gesture. The specific self-composure motion of a woman putting herself back together in the only way available. And Naya watched it without hostility. Whatever Seo-rin was, she was not the primary thing Naya had needed her to be. She was not the enemy. She was a piece of a larger structure that had been moving her the same way it had been moving everyone else. And she had arrived in this room at midnight and sat down and told the truth about the boundary of her knowledge. And that was more than several people in the evening's proceedings had managed. Seo-rin looked at Tae-hyun. Something passed between them. Not warmth, not hostility, the specific complex nothing of two people who have a long history and have arrived, through different routes, at the same exhausted understanding that the history is over and what follows it will be built from different materials entirely. "I'll contact my family's attorney in the morning," Seo-rin said. "About the office's exposure." Tae-hyun said, "I know." She looked at Naya. She said, "The dress is extraordinary." Nya looked at her. She said, "I know." Seo-rin walked out. The door closed. The room was quiet. Ding-dong. They were alone for the first time all evening, and the aloneness had a different quality than anything the evening had contained. Not the charged aloneness of opposition, not the tense proximity of the south window conversation, but something flatter and stranger, the aloneness of two people in the aftermath of a thing that has cost both of them significantly and has not resolved itself into anything as clean as victory or defeat. Nya sat down. Not in the chair she had occupied during the statements, a different one, near the window, where the city came through in the pre-dawn darkness, in the flat, honest way it came through her studio on mornings when she had worked through the night. She was tired in a way that had moved past the sensation of tiredness, into a kind of structural settling, the body reassembling after sustained tension, finding its actual weight after hours of holding itself above it. Taehyun stayed standing for a moment, and then he sat down too. Not across from her, not beside her, at an angle. The chair turned slightly toward her, the way a person turns toward someone they are not certain they have the right to face directly. They sat in the quiet of the aftermath. Outside, Seoul ran its usual indifferent engine, traffic on the elevated expressway. The river dark and moving below the obsidian tower. The city as permanent and uninterested in individual human wreckage as it had always been. Its scale making every private catastrophe simultaneously enormous and completely invisible. Taehyun spoke first. "The restitution structure I built. It's real. It was never conditional on the marriage or on what happened afterward. It will transfer regardless." He paused. "The principal is approximately 60% of the documented licensing revenue from the years following the Hansung restructuring. It's not everything, but it's what I could build without destroying the current organization's legal employees, the people who have nothing to do with what my father did." Nya looked at the window. "How many people?" "In the current organization, functioning legally, about 300. The construction subsidiaries, the logistics operations, the property management structures." He paused. "They didn't choose my father. Some of them have been there for 20 years. They're not responsible for the original theft." She looked at this from every angle available to her. She had not thought about the 300. She had thought about Malcolm, about Vanessa, about the evidence and the filing and the restoration of a name. She had thought about the corporate structure as a mechanism of harm rather than as the employment context of 300 people who had not been in any room that mattered. She filed this. She did not discard it. The legal proceedings will determine what happens to the organization, she said. That's not mine to decide unilaterally. That's what the process is for. I know. But I'll tell my attorney that the restitution structure exists and should be part of the record, that it was built before the filing, that it was voluntary. She looked at him. That matters. I'll make sure it's documented that it matters. He looked at her. He looked at her for a long moment with the reading quality that she had spent 18 months learning and would probably spend the rest of her life half knowing, the specific architecture of a face that had been trained to reveal nothing and had, tonight, revealed more than she had seen from it in all the months before. He said, "Why?" "Because the truth isn't only the theft," she said. "The truth is the whole record. I came here for the truth. That means all of it, including the parts that don't make the case simpler." He was quiet. She looked at her hands in her lap, the hands that had held her father's document tonight, her father's signature under her thumbs, the specific physical reality of something she had been chasing for 3 years resolving into paper and ink, and the weight of a thing actually in her possession. She thought about Malcolm at his work table. She thought about the notebook she had memorized in the years of grief, the M of his handwriting, the careful precision of a man who built things meant to last. She thought about the promise she had made in a hospital room. Your father's name will never disappear. It wouldn't. It was in the filing. It was in the evidentiary record. It would be in the legal proceedings and the documentation and whatever public accounting came from all of it. Malcolm Brooks, the origin point. The man who built the thing that had been taken, restored to the record, returned to the history, given back the authorship of his own work in whatever institutional form the law could provide. It was not enough. Nothing was going to be enough in the way she had originally understood the word. Nothing was going to bring him back to his work table. Nothing was going to give him the years that had been taken. Nothing was going to unexhaust her mother or unbreak the specific mechanism inside Malcolm Brooks that had broken when the world told him his work had no owner. She understood this now with a completeness she had not been capable of 3 years ago when she made the promise. The completeness of a person who has pursued a thing to its end and found that the end is real and finite and does not undo the damage, but adds something to the record that was not there before. A correction, a visible correction that anyone who looked would find. It was not enough. It was what there was. She breathed. The divorce stands, she said. It was not a question, and it was not directed at him as a request for response. It was said aloud in the room because it needed to exist in the air between them, clearly, without softening or ambiguity. Yes, he said. The marriage was real, she said, whatever else it was. He looked at her. Yes. And you knew why I came here from the beginning. Yes. And you married me anyway. A long pause. I married you because the restitution structure was the right thing to do, and I couldn't find a way to do it that didn't require proximity. I told myself that was the reason. He stopped. Something shifted in his face. Not the controlled nothing, not the reading look. The third thing, the one she had only seen clearly for the first time tonight. The thing that lived behind the architecture of the man that 2 decades of a particular kind of power had built. It stopped being the reason. Baum Betrayal. She looked at him. I know, she said. The room held this. She did not offer him anything beyond the acknowledgement. She was not capable of offering more than that tonight, and she was not certain she would be capable of it in any of the nights that followed. And she was honest enough with herself, sitting in the East reception room at 2 a.m, with the GALA broken down and the filing submitted and the document secure, to know that the incapacity was not entirely about what he had done. Some of it was simply the cost of 3 years inside a particular kind of purpose. The specific erosion that occurs when a person has organized themselves entirely around a single outcome for so long that the outcome's arrival leaves them with the question of what they are without it. She did not know yet. She was going to have to find out. She left the Obsidian Tower at 2:37 in the morning. The lobby was mostly empty. A night security guard at the desk, a maintenance crew with equipment near the elevator bank, The specific institutional quiet of a large building after its purpose for the evening has been discharged. She walked through it in her burgundy gown with her clutch under her arm and her heels making the only sound in the lobby's marble expanse. And she pushed through the glass door and the Seoul night came at her all at once. The temperature drop, the city smell, the distant sound of traffic on the bridge over the Han, the specific quality of the pre-dawn city that she had first encountered 3 years ago when she arrived from Atlanta with $14,000 and her father's notebooks and a plan that had looked, from the inside, like the only possible version of her life. She stood on the sidewalk outside the tower. She had no car. She had sent her driver home at midnight per the original plan, which had not accounted for the plan changing shape in the way it had. She could call someone. She could walk. The night was cold enough to feel real against her skin, and the gown was not warm and she did not move immediately. She thought about calling Jiwon. He would answer. He had answered every call she had made in 4 months of the most demanding period of a 3-year operation, and he would answer this one, and he would tell her what needed to happen next in the procedural sequence, and she would write it down and it would give her the next thing to move toward. She did not call him. She stood on the sidewalk in her gown in the pre-dawn cold, and she let herself be a person who had just finished something enormous and did not yet know what came after it, and she let that not knowing exist without immediately replacing it with a plan. Because the plan had been load-bearing for 3 years, and it was done, and the weight it had been carrying needed somewhere to go, and she was, at 2:37 in the morning, on a sidewalk outside the tower she had built her gala in, willing to be the place it went. Her eyes were dry. They stayed dry. She was not a person who cried easily, and she had not become one, but she stood in the cold and she thought about her father. Not the end of him, not the work table and the document and the Sunday morning, but the beginning. The workshop in East Atlanta, the bolt of fabric with the living pattern, his real laugh coming up through his chest at a 7-year-old who had found the right word for it, the quality of his attention when he was working, the way he talked about his work as something with a logic that was discoverable rather than invented, as if the patterns were already there in the material and his job was to find them. She had found them. She had found the pattern, and she had followed it from Atlanta to Seoul, and through 3 years of building and waiting and the specific private catastrophe of loving a man she had come to confront. And she had followed it to a document on a table at midnight and a filing that was now in the hands of people with the authority to do something with it, and her father's name was in the record, and the record was real. She thought, I kept the promise. She thought, I don't know who I am now. Both things were true at the same time and did not cancel each other out. She started walking, not in any particular direction initially, just walking, the gown slightly too long for sidewalk use, her heels finding the pavement with the regular rhythm of forward motion, the city around her doing its pre-dawn version of being alive. She passed a pojangmacha whose owner was setting up for the early morning, the small covered cart smelling of broth and warm starch. The owner working with the practiced speed of someone who had done this setup thousands of times and would do it thousands more. He glanced at her, the gown, the hour, the general dissonance of the full picture, and then looked back at his setup without comment. Seoul had seen stranger things at stranger hours. She walked for 20 minutes and found herself on the river path, the Han dark and wide on her left, the city bridge lights reflected in broken pieces on the water's surface. She stopped at a bench and sat down and looked at the water, and she let herself sit there in the cold in her burgundy gown with the clutch in her lap and the document inside it, and the night moving toward morning around her. She thought about what came next. There would be proceedings. Long ones, like her attorney had told her to expect 18 months minimum before anything resolved, and attorneys were optimists about timelines. There would be depositions and motions and the specific grinding patience of institutional justice moving at institutional speed. There would be coverage, probably, not immediately, but when the case became public, and it would become public, and her name would be in it, and Malcolm's name would be in it, and the Baeko structure would be in it, and Taehyun's name would be in it, and she would have to navigate all of that in front of the clients, and the industry, and the city that had spent 3 years watching Maison Nya grow from a rented gallery showing to the crown of Seoul's luxury fashion world. She would navigate it. She had built the navigation capacity over 3 years along with everything else, and it was real, and it would hold. Maison Nya would hold. She was certain of this in the way she was certain of structural things she had built herself from tested materials, not with the certainty of someone who has never had something break, but with the certainty of someone who has learned exactly where the breaking points are and has reinforced each one. What she did not know yet was the thing beyond the proceedings and the company and the navigable external landscape. What she was without the plan. Who she was in the mornings that would come now without the architecture of a 3-year purpose beneath them. The answer was going to come through living rather than through calculation, and she had spent so long inside the calculation that living as the primary mode felt, sitting here on a river bench at 3 in the morning, like a language she was going to have to relearn. She was going to have to relearn it. She was capable of it. She looked at the water for a long time. When the sky began to lighten, the specific pre-dawn graying that arrives before the actual color of morning, the light finding its level before it finds its warmth, she took the document out of her clutch, and she held it in both hands, and she looked at her father's signature one more time in the growing light. Malcolm Brooks. The M of it. The specific formation she had known since she was 7 years old, watching him sign things at his workshop desk, checking the M before reading anything else the way you check the face of a person you love before processing any other part of the room. She folded the document carefully. She put it back. She stood up. The Han River moved behind her, dark and wide and continuous. The same river it had been before she arrived in this city, and the same river it would be long after she was finished here. The bridge lights were pale in the growing morning. Somewhere across the water, Seoul was beginning its day. The first buses moving, the first lights coming on in apartment windows, the city resuming its enormous, indifferent life. She was still in the city. She was still here. She turned away from the river, and she walked. Not back to the tower, not to the studio, not to the apartment she had shared with a man she had married for complicated reasons and loved for simpler ones, and was now leaving in the only direction available, forward. She walked in the early morning light of a city that had tried for 3 years to make her feel like a visitor, with her gown trailing slightly on the pavement, and her heels finding their rhythm, and her shoulders carrying the specific posture of a woman who has been told repeatedly in various languages that she does not belong somewhere and has built something extraordinary there anyway. Her father's name was in the record. Her company was real. She was real. The morning came up over Seoul the way mornings came up, indifferent, unhurried, making no promises, and offering no commentary on the people moving through it, the light arriving simply because it was the time for light to arrive, and the city was there to receive it. Nia walked through it with her face forward and her hands at her sides, and everything she had built intact inside her, the grief and the love, and the cost and the completion all present at once, not resolved into anything simpler than what they were. She did not need them to be simpler. She had never needed things to be simpler. She walked until she found a cafe opening its doors for the morning, the owner fitting the key into the lock as she approached, and she stopped and waited while the door opened and the smell of coffee came out into the cold air. And she went inside and sat down at a table near the window where she could see the street, and she ordered coffee, and she waited for the day to begin. It began.